Hi there, my name is Ursula. Welcome to the Velvet Lair. Here we talk about true crime, mysterious stories, and historically related content. Sometimes a little bit of artsy content here and there, and we might even talk about movies or series from time to time. So if you're new here, don't hesitate to subscribe and let's dive into today's story. I'm doing this series, Deadly Women Around the World, and this is episode number 2. We are going to Singapore today to find out about Flor Contemplacion. She was born in 1953. She was a Filipina, 42 years old, and had 4 kids, one son, a daughter, and then twin boys. She was married and her husband stayed in the Philippines with her children while she, like many other Filipinos, took her chances and flew abroad to find work and provide for her family from a distance. She found work in Singapore as a household worker in somebody's residence. She was helping out with everyday household tasks, so we could say a domestic worker. So what happened? On May 4th of 1991, another household worker called Delia Maga was found strangled to death in the residence of her employer, along with the 4-year-old boy that she was taking care of, called Nicolas Huang, who was found drowned, unfortunately. Okay, so how does that relate to Flor? Well, Flor Contemplacion was found through entries in Delia Maga's diary. She was interrogated and she confessed to the murder of Delia and Nicolas. To the Filipino embassy in Singapore, her confession seemed credible, and so she was charged with murder. She was convicted and was to be executed by hanging. It was later claimed that she may have made her confession under torture. It was also claimed that she may not have been all sane at the time of the murders. Moving on. During the week prior to her execution, 2 other Filipino citizens residing in Singapore came forward, suggesting that Nicolas's father had framed Flor for the murders, that he had come home and killed Delia in a fit of rage when he found out about his son's drowning. Nicolas was epileptic, and allegedly he would have had an attack while in the bathtub, and Delia would have only found out about it when it was too late. Side note, please do not leave your kids unattended in water, whether it be the bathtub or a sink or a pool. These things can happen so fast. It really makes me sick just thinking about it. Moving on. Virginie Paromug, one of the witnesses who came forward, said while under oath that she had shared a cell with Flor and that Flor had revealed to her that she was in fact at Delia's house when they both discovered the boy having drowned. When they did, Delia immediately took the phone and informed her employer about the incident. He then rushed home, probably strangled Delia to death out of rage, out of anger, then called the police and implicated Flor in the double murder. A Singaporean Home Affairs Ministry statement denounced her allegation and said this. I'll read it because, These claims are pure fabrication. The wild and baseless allegations of Virginie Parumog are yet another attempt to stir up controversy over the Flor Contemplacion case without any regard for the truth. According to the ministry, when the police arrived, Flor was not at the residence. She was later found through the entries in the diary of Delia. Okay, that doesn't contradict anything that Flor had said. It also said that it was not the father who called the police, but the mother. Side note here, to me, this debunks nothing because Flor could have very well been at the house with Delia and then left the house before the employer came back so as not to get her friend in more trouble, because she probably wasn't supposed to be having visits over when she was working. They surely thought that her employer would be even more angry and would blame them for having had or having engaged in friendly conversations while his son was drowning in the bathtub because they were not paying attention to what was going on in the bathroom, which could have very well been the case. In fact, it could have very well happened that way. If it did, that would also, in my mind, explain the kind of guilt that she might have felt, feeling maybe partly responsible for the death of two people now, just because of her being at her friend's house while she was maybe not supposed to, and distracting her from her tasks, which resulted in the boy passing, and later on in her friend getting maybe murdered by her employer. Having been partly responsible for all that could have weighed on her heavily, and that could have been why she confessed, or that could have also been why she didn't retract her confession or come forward with her story of her having been there and witnessed the accident or the incident. I'm just speculating here, but this story or this version of the story makes way more sense to me than the temporary insanity claim where she would have just lost her mind and killed her friend and killed the little boy and then left. No real motive. I don't know. I'm just speculating here, but to me, the fact that she wasn't here at the time when the police arrived does not mean that everything else that she said was false. The fact that the mother called and not the father is something that would have happened after they both arrived at the residence. So if she had left before, once again, she could have just speculated that the father called, but no, that doesn't mean anything to me. Anyways, back to the story. The ministry statement also dismissed other claims made by Virginie, like the fact that she had been given electroshock treatment while awaiting the trial and that she had been drugged. They said that she had been given 2 electroencephalogram tests, one of which was actually ordered by her defense psychiatrist. They also said that the only medication they gave her were for headaches and a sore throat. Who knows? But if she had told her friend about the electroencephalogram tests, I mean, I don't know if she was very well educated on what an electroencephalogram test is, and she could have maybe, mistaken this for electroshock treatment. I don't know. I'm just once again speculating here, but one could, make that mistake maybe. Also, she might have been drugged if she was freaking out about the electroshock treatment and they just gave her something to calm down. I don't know. I'm just speculating here, but who knows? During the first trial, no medical evidence was introduced, neither by the defense nor by the prosecution, in spite of the bizarre symptoms experienced on the day of the murders, which she talked about in her confession. The statement also pointed out that she had ample opportunity to protest her innocence, and yet she didn't. They stated that she had had 9 visits by the Philippine embassy officials during her trial, which, by the way, lasted 2 years. So 9 visits in 2 years is not that much, if you ask me. But yeah, they considered that this was ample opportunity to protest and that they didn't hear any complaints about any ill treatment, nor about her being innocent. They even said, quote, "Are we to believe that if Flor Contemplacion felt that she was innocent, she would choose to say so only to a prostitute in prison?" Not sure I like that little comment, but according to the Home Ministry, Virginie had been arrested in 92, 3 years prior to that, because all of this is happening in 95, the week prior to her execution. So she has spent, by that time, 4 years in prison. So yeah, they stated that Virginie had been arrested in 92 and had signed a statement saying that she was in Singapore for prostitution. Okay, so once again, side note, objection. Why would that be relevant, what she did? Why she came to Singapore? I mean, if she was in jail for prostitution, well, she was an inmate, so every inmate has a story, and that doesn't mean that inmates don't often help solve cases by coming forward with stories fed to them directly by the culprits. So I don't see how that is relevant. I don't know. They were two Filipinas imprisoned in a foreign country, sharing a cell. Of course, she would have maybe bonded with her and confided in her and told her the story, her story. I mean, why not? I don't see the issue here. Evangeline Parale, a second witness, said that she had been in the same hospital as Flor and that Flor had told her the same story. She added that Flor had told her that she had been tortured into confessing to the murders. So that's that. The Singaporean court wanted none of this. They, quote unquote, considered and rejected the testimonies, basically. On appeal, the case went back to the same trial judge to allow medical evidence to be introduced by the defense. They stated that she was suffering from a partial complex seizure during the time of the murders, and it would be an unusual form of epilepsy. The prosecution maintained that she was just suffering from a mild migraine that day, and that's all. So that once again was rejected, and she was once again convicted and sentenced to death. She received minimal consular support from the Philippine embassy in Singapore during her 2 years of trial, besides having visited her 9 times, according to the Singaporean ministry. They were not there in court to observe, so there were no representatives of the Philippine embassy in court throughout her whole trial, basically. The Department of Foreign Affairs and the Philippine Embassy in Singapore showed an active interest in her case only in the weeks leading up to her execution, when emotions in the Philippines were running high. That's when they requested a stay of execution on humanitarian considerations, quote, to put all doubts to rest before the case of Mrs. Contemplacion comes to a final conclusion, end quote. Even the Philippine president, Fidel Ramos, personally asked Singapore to postpone the execution until the new evidence, aka the testimonies, had been evaluated. But the Singaporean government wanted none of it. It said it carefully investigated this new evidence and that it found it to be untrue. Therefore, the Singaporean president, Ong Teng Cheong, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, found there was no basis to justify the stay of execution. In those final weeks before her execution, Flor was visited every day in Changi prison. I'm not sure how you say Changi prison. Every day she was visited by her children. She hadn't seen them since before leaving for Singapore in 1989, so that was almost 6 years back, I think. But her husband didn't visit her. He said he couldn't bear to see her and not be able to hold her and embrace her after 7 years. I mean, she's about to be executed, dude. It's been 7 years. She has a week left. Accompany your kids. Go see her. I don't get it. I don't. Yeah. Yeah. I don't. Yeah. No. No. She was informed of the date and time of the hanging on Tuesday, as was customary in Singapore, and she was to be hanged on Friday before dawn. She took the news calmly. She was resigned to her fate, and she tried to be strong and told her children to be strong as well and love one another. Sad. Flor had said on the eve of her execution that she was ready to die. After final pleas for clemency and a new trial had been rejected, she thought, if a stay of execution is only going to delay her sentence, she preferred to end everyone's suffering sooner instead. She was hanged before dawn on Friday, the 17th of March of 1995, together with 3 male drug traffickers. There were police cars and motorcycles patrolling in the streets, apparently to deter protests from the estimated 75,000 Filipinos living in Singapore at that time. Anger swept the Philippines when news of the execution broke. Everyone denounced Singapore as a barbaric, tyrannical, and totalitarian state with no respect for human rights. The Roman Catholic Church called it a state without mercy. There were protests outside of the Singapore embassy in Manila and several other protests across the Philippines. A politician, Rodrigo Duterte, even burned a Singaporean flag while leading 1,000 people in a protest in Davao City. Needless to say that the relations between Singapore and the Philippines chilled for several years after the execution. So 2 days after the execution, Flor's body was released and flown back to Manila, where it was greeted by the president's wife, Amelita, who, along with her husband, the president, and the Filipino people, saw Flor as an icon or a heroine. Some people waved handkerchiefs, others waved signs demanding justice for Flor. Everyone was in the streets. Thousands united in the small town of San Pablo, where she was born and where she had lived, to pay their last respects. More than 5,000 people flocked around her house, trying to catch a glimpse of her body in its open white coffin. The president offered financial assistance to Flor's children, who depended on their mother's income to live, and he pledged 1 month of his salary to a college scholarship fund. If you ask me, they still need to eat and live, and if they were dependent on their mother's income, a scholarship fund, okay, well, it's still something. Many Filipinos believed that Flor was innocent, or at least suffering from insanity if she committed the murders. They blamed the Singaporean government for being merciless and the Philippines government, their own government, for not doing much to stop the execution. The Philippine embassy in Singapore particularly was criticized for not having even been present in court throughout the 2-year duration of her trial. Yeah, that looks bad, huh? The Filipinos, they cared and they showed it. The Philippine Secretaries of Foreign Affairs, Roberto Romulo, and Labor and Employment, Nieves Confessor, both resigned as a result of the controversy. President Ramos recalled the Filipino ambassador in Singapore to the country, and many bilateral exchanges between the two countries were cancelled. I read that the investments of Singapore in the Philippines went from 64 either million or billion, I don't know, dollars in 1994 to 3.7 million or billion, I forget, in 1995. The economic side of things came back rather quick, but the human relations was not the same. Regardless of her innocence or her guilt, she became the face of the alleged abuse and exploitative working conditions of Filipino workers abroad, especially domestic workers. President Ramos ordered the exhumation of Delia's body to find out how she died. Her former husband complained that he and the family had never seen her autopsy reports. When Filipino investigators dug up her body, they found out that she had been beaten. Bones were broken, fractured. Some even alleged that the Singaporean pathologists might have tampered with the cadaver to simulate signs of strangulation. So Singapore's Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, agreed to a joint autopsy, at which the Philippine forensic experts saw their suspicions confirmed. She had a fractured skull. Her throat was almost crushed due to the force that had been inflicted on it. And their further investigations showed that it's unlikely that a woman might have had or would have had enough strength to do such damage. But the Singaporeans, who had hired a trio of American dry bone experts to help gain moral absolution for the hasty execution, professed the opposite. So that's that. I mean, they weren't willingly going to lose the face, quote unquote. Now were they? But who knows? And for those of you who don't know, the expression "lose the face," at least in Vietnam, it's when you get embarrassed or you get called out. Yeah, that's what it means. But I guess you probably knew. It's pretty self-explanatory. So anyway, who knows? But we do know this. The accused was given inadequate representation. And when questions started arising, the Singaporeans were quick with the news, and it's kind of looking like they might have been covering up some official wrongdoing, but once again, just speculating. There was scientific evidence to dispute the murder charges against Flor. For instance, her fingerprints were never found on the crime scene. None at all. Furthermore, she didn't really have a motive to do this. Did she? But none of that led to a retrial. Singapore was a police state at the time. Once it had made up its mind on a specific case, nothing was going to stop it from letting its justice run its course. Yeah, it reminds me of another case of a teenager called Michael Fay, I think. Yes, he was caned. He was caned for vandalism by graffiti. So caned, meaning, beaten with a cane. He was sentenced to a few months of jail and 6 lashes with a cane. And despite President Bill Clinton's intervention, he was still caned. President Clinton managed to take 2 lashes off of his sentence, so he got 4 lashes instead of 6, but he was still caned, and he still had a few months of jail time. There was another man, a Dutch man called Johannes van Damme, and he was hanged for drug trafficking, despite protests from all over Europe. So he was caught at the what's the name of that airport? Changi Airport? No, that's the jail, prison. Oh, he was caught at the airport with approximately 4.5 kilograms, I think, of heroin in his bags, which he claimed were not his. And he was the first foreigner to be executed in Singapore, but he would not be the last. The economy in the Philippines is heavily dependent on the 2 billion and then some dollars brought in or sent home annually by an estimated 3 million Filipino workers, mainly women who work overseas, of course. And they are regularly executed in such countries as Saudi Arabia, usually for drug trafficking. They also seem to frequently be the victims of abuse by their wealthy employers. At the time, there were about 7,000 to 8,000 Filipinos in prison in other countries and 90 on death row. The Nupl, National Union of People's Lawyers of the Philippines, is committed to defend, protect, and promote human rights, especially of the poor and oppressed, like Flor. They, however, face challenges in carrying out these tasks as they are a volunteer organization. They lack lawyers and funds, and meanwhile, the cases don't run out because the problem is systemic. The government's labor export policy itself could be the problem, as it sends Filipinos for employment outside the country instead of creating jobs at home. I'll leave a link at the bottom for the official Facebook page of the NUPL so you can check it out if you want to learn more and maybe help out. I'm just going to read this part because it's a bit complicated for me in English. Flor's case pushed the enactment of the Magna Carta of OFWs, as the government pledged that Flor would be the first and last Filipina to be executed outside the country. The Magna Carta, which means the Great Charter, according to which everyone is subject to the law, even the king, guarantees the rights of individuals, the rights to justice, and the rights to a fair trial. So that's at least one good thing that came out of this horrible story. The Migrant Workers and Overseas Filipinos Act of 1995 may also have been established in relation to the events. It's an act to institute the policies of overseas employment and establish a higher standard of protection and promotion of the welfare of migrant workers and their families and overseas Filipinos in distress, amongst other things. It's supposed to cover those subjects mainly, so that would be a good thing. But even in there, in the Migrant Workers and Overseas Filipinos Act, I read that the government still incentivizes Filipinos to go and find work abroad. So that's still a thing. Her story was also made into a movie called The Flor Contemplacion story, winning Best Picture in the Cairo Film Festival in 1995, so the same year that she was executed. I hope some of the earnings went to some kind of cause. Hopefully. The public anger continued when a similar case arose only a few months later with Sarah Balabagan in the United Arab Emirates. She is a Filipina as well, who was imprisoned from 94 to 96 for murder. She was initially sentenced to death, but was later returned to the Philippines, so she had a happy end. Good for her. In 1994, she killed her employer, stabbing him 34 times. It's a lot of stabbing. She alleged that he had tried to rape her and that she was acting in self-defense. Okay. Could be. He might have been a very big guy. You know, I'm not judging. Just trying to, understand. It was only after a personal appeal for mercy from the president of the United Arab Emirates that her employer's family agreed to drop their execution demand in exchange for blood money. The family has execution demands. They agree to drop them for blood money. What? This is not how justice works over here. So, interesting. Her sentence was reduced to a year's imprisonment and 100 strokes of the cane, along with payment of blood money, which was donated by a Filipino businessman. Thank you, mister. And here we go with the caning again. Okay. So 100 strokes of cane. She was caned in 20 strokes at a time over 5 days. She returned to the Philippines on August 1st, 1996, to a hero's welcome. Okay, well, at least she returned. 20 years later, with Mary Jane Veloso, a single mother of 2 boys, it happened again. She was convicted of drug trafficking in Indonesia and sentenced to death by a firing squad. Her execution was temporarily stayed by Indonesian President Joko Widodo, so she is still alive. And Flor Contemplacion's daughter, Russell, has extended a message of hope to the family. In regards to Flor's family, in March of 2011, Flor's 3 boys were sentenced to life imprisonment and to pay a fine of 500,000 pesos each for selling illegal drugs. Flor's husband and his partner were also put in jail for drug pushing in 2008, and they are all still in jail. The only one that managed to avoid jail time was Russell, her daughter, and she still had to deal with a drug-addicted husband and juggle between motherhood and work life, and she has struggled greatly, but at least she's out of jail. So that's it for today. If you like the video, don't hesitate to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content. I'll see you next week with another episode of Deadly Women Around the World.